Welcome back, everyone. We're half past the hour. Overnight, the Department of Homeland Security revoking legal protections for hundreds of thousands of Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans. This now sets them up for potential deportation in about a month. The order applies to about 532,000 people that have lived in the U.S. under a temporary status since October of 2022. Now, this new policy impacts those who came under the humanitarian parole program. Let's bring in federal defense attorney Ronald Chapman. Ronald, good morning. Always great to see you. So those impacted by this order were given a 2-year permit to be in the U.S. I should mention to our viewers that date has passed. But they came here, like I mentioned, under the humanitarian parole program. So what are the legal implications here? What could this outcome mean?
Well, here's the concern. They have no legal status, and there's so many of them. I'm sure that there's going to be some relief granted by some of the judges as soon as it's sought, likely by some of these immigrants. And, I imagine there's probably going to be an injunction stopping this. But the reality is that President Trump has broad authority when it comes to immigration. The courts have typically given him that broad authority. And I would expect that when this starts to escalate up to the Supreme Court, if they take something, they've been moving very slow on these issues lately, it will likely be allowed. I mean, this is something that is allowed by the pen of the president and can certainly be revoked in that form as well.
And to your point, especially since they don't have a legal status, it's past their timing of those 2 years. In a D.C. courtroom on Friday, a federal judge questioned the legality of the Trump administration's authority to deport hundreds of migrants. There was no due process, and its refusal to answer his questions. The judge said the administration is being evasive. Now, this is about whether the president's use of this wartime alien enemies power is legal. Ronald, help us understand the issue here and what the administration still needs to show the judge.
I'm a bit concerned about a slippery slope here when it comes to the alien enemies power. We've got a very old law. It's only been used a few times before, and it's traditionally used when we are actually at war. In this case, it's being used against a gang, and Trump said himself he believes that we are at war with them, but that's not enough to invoke this law. But the concern I have here is a judge ordering a plane to turn around when this has already happened. They were quite late in getting to court in relation to this, and I don't think that sort of relief was going to be appropriate. But I do see this judge potentially holding the administration in contempt in relation to those activities. And I don't expect that this use of this act is going to be upheld in the future, even when it escalates up to the appellate courts or even the Supreme Court.
Here's what President Trump said about this very issue on Friday.
These are hard, tough criminals, and we have to get them out. And you can't stop that with a judge sitting behind a bench that has no idea what goes on, who happens to be a radical left lunatic.
All right, we are learning every person on that flight was not a gang member. Of course, we're learning that much later. You mentioned administration could be held on contempt. Then what happens? And how does this impact Americans? And what is the Trump administration doing in each of these cases?
It's really hard to hold a government in contempt of court. It's not like an individual where you can throw them in jail. The reality is that the judge is going to have to take it out on the lawyers that are representing the government. There could be fines. There could be additional relief granted in a case like this by the judge. There could be dismissal of potentially some of the defenses. We could see that. But what does this mean for Americans? Well, it's always very concerning, and we always need to be on the lookout for a loss of due process. In this case, many of these people, if not all of them, were not vetted before they were determined to be deported under this act. That's the very concerning thing. That's why due process exists in this country, and we should make sure that we adhere to at least some notions of due process before we make a call like this. Otherwise, we get a result that's very concerning. Somebody who is not of that nation might get sent back there, and there may be terrible human rights abuses inflicted upon them, and the United States may have caused that as a result of a lack of due process. That's why we don't use an act like this, and we follow our normal immigration laws that we already have on the books.
On Friday, the president asserted that Secretary of State Marco Rubio has the authority to continue those flights. So what can the justice system do if the administration defies his court order and Rubio keeps sending these flights overseas?
Well, that's a really good question. The judge doesn't have a lot of options in the toolkit. There's going to be additional injunctions. There can be fines against the administration. But the reality is that if we've got one activist judge who's making this call, until that rifles up to the Supreme Court, we're not likely going to see the Trump administration adhere to that ruling. But what I would likely see is this case to get in the hands of the Supreme Court, and the Trump administration certainly will adhere to what the court says, and likely what a higher appellate court says. I don't have any concerns that the Trump administration is going to violate that.
And we should mention a few years ago, this very judge ruled on the side of President Trump when it came to not releasing his tax returns. 2 months into this second term for our president, the U.S. Supreme Court facing that critical question over birthright citizenship. Multiple reports suggest the Supreme Court is no hurry to rule on this case. Ronald, why are they so slow about this, and what is the arguments on both sides?
The Supreme Court needs to move very slow for a very specific reason. When the Supreme Court speaks, oftentimes the implications of that can be massive, and we don't want our system swinging wildly back and forth from Supreme Court ruling to Supreme Court ruling. It's best for them to let a number of these cases filter up to the court so that they can assess the issue and make the decision that is going to keep our system in balance and ensure that the laws are adhered to. Reacting and being very reactive in any one of these individual cases is going to cause a tremendous imbalance to the system. And to be honest, we're talking about very serious presidential powers issues, and they're greater than one individual case or one individual application. The Supreme Court recognizes that, and so that's why they're not going to hear a lot of these requests for injunctions or stays related to the Trump cases.
I like Ronald Chapman. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.